They charged without fear, shouting, screaming, certain that no American weapon could stop them. But that was before the jungle lit up, before the night sky turned orange, before a new American firestorm roared to life. What happened next was so shocking that even hardened veterans would remember it for the rest of their lives. The Japanese infantry, throughout the Pacific War, had a reputation that few American soldiers would ever forget. These were men conditioned from the earliest days of their training to believe that fear was weakness, hesitation was failure, and death in battle was the only honorable destiny for a warrior. Their discipline wasn't just strict, it bordered on absolute devotion. When they charged, they did so with the kind of ferocity that made seasoned Marines tighten their grip on their rifles. It wasn't just bravery, it was belief that momentum, aggression, and sheer force of will could shatter any defensive line, no matter how strong. Many American troops arriving in the Pacific for the first time were stunned the moment they encountered their first Japanese charge. Textbooks and briefings never captured the reality. The shouts echoing through the jungle, the sudden crash of boots pounding over roots and dirt, the sight of bayonets glinting in the dim glow of torches or moonlight. Even the calmest soldiers felt a chill run up their spines when they first heard the infamous bands. Cries slicing through the dark like blades of sound. These infantrymen did not advance cautiously. They surged forward in coordinated waves, their officers often leading from the very front, swords raised, urging their men into the jaws of gunfire. In many battles, Japanese troops continued their assaults even after suffering staggering casualties, refusing to break formation, refusing to retreat. There were moments when American units, well-trained and well-supplied, felt as if they were being swallowed by a storm made of human bodies and unbreakable determination. The Japanese tactics were designed not just to overwhelm the enemy physically, but to shatter their morale, to make the defenders believe resistance was useless, that nothing could stop the wave once it began. This fearless momentum had worked on countless islands, catching Allied forces off guard and driving them back before they could stabilize their positions. American troops quickly learned that their adversaries were unlike any they had faced in Europe. These men weren't deterred by machine gun fire, artillery barrages, or the odds stacked against them. They pressed forward through thick jungle, over ridges, across open ground, often appearing in places that the Americans believed were impossible to reach. Their endurance seemed superhuman at times, pushing through hunger, disease, and exhaustion without slowing their pace. To them, a charge wasn't just a tactic. It was a test of spirit, a measure of honor, a demonstration of absolute dedication to the emperor and to their comrades. Yet behind their fearlessness was a system, a culture built on years of conditioning, loyalty, and rigid military doctrine. Officers demanded unwavering obedience. Soldiers were taught that surrender was a disgrace so severe it would stain their families for generations. This belief forged warriors who treated death as a final victory, not a defeat. And because of this mindset, their charges carried a terrifying power, a momentum fueled not by orders alone, but by conviction stirring deep within each soldier's chest. American troops soon learned that when the jungle suddenly fell silent, when the faint breeze stopped moving the leaves, when even the insects seemed to pause, the charge was coming. And when it did, it came like a tidal wave, unstoppable, fearless, and ready to tear through anything in its path. For the American troops caught in the path of the Japanese charge, the first moments were always the hardest. Even experienced soldiers, men who had survived earlier clashes, felt their hearts quicken as the jungle erupted with shouts and crashing footsteps. Lines that seemed secure minutes earlier suddenly felt thin and fragile. The Americans knew their weapons were powerful, their positions fortified, yet nothing truly prepared them for the speed and weight of those first assault waves. Machine gunners swung their barrels across the brush, firing blind bursts into the shadows, desperate to break the momentum before it reached them. Riflemen steadied their hands as adrenaline surged, trying to aim through the trembling of fear and anticipation. In those first chaotic seconds, the Japanese infantry often seemed like phantoms, appearing out of darkness, out of smoke, out of the tangled trees with a suddenness that broke every sense of battlefield rhythm. The Americans would fire, reload, fire again, watching shapes move closer no matter how many rounds tore through the brush. It felt like trying to stop a river with bare hands. They could hear officers yelling orders behind them, trying to keep the line steady, but the noise around them swallowed every sound except gunfire and the relentless shouting of the attackers. Some American positions were overrun quickly, especially those on the outer perimeter, where visibility was poor and support limited. Men pulled back, stumbling through the mud, trying to regroup before the next wave hit. The jungle's thick foliage made coordinated defense nearly impossible. Communication lines snapped. Radios crackled uselessly. Soldiers were left with instinct and training, firing from behind roots, logs, and makeshift barricades. Many felt the terrifying sensation of not knowing whether they were shooting at the enemy or at shadows shaped by fear. The Japanese exploited this confusion ruthlessly. They pushed forward with an aggression the Americans hadn't expected. Bayonet charges forced close, quarters fighting where training and reflexes mattered more than strategy. The crack of rifles gave way to the clash of steel, desperate shouts, and the grunts of struggling bodies locked in combat. American units that had never imagined facing hand-to-hand combat found themselves wrestling for survival in the mud and leaves. And yet, amid all this chaos, the Americans fought with grit. They fell back in small groups, reorganizing whenever they found ground firm enough to stand. Medics dragged wounded men behind cover, ignoring bullets buzzing through the branches. Junior officers took command when seniors fell, rallying whoever they could find. But the truth was harsh. The Japanese charge created a pressure so heavy that even seasoned troops felt overwhelmed. Every passing minute felt like an hour. The Americans were exhausted, their weapons hot, their magazines nearly empty. They feared that another wave would push through and break the line completely. The pounding of feet, the chilling yells, the flashes of movement, everything blended into a single, terrifying realization. The Japanese infantry was not slowing down. They kept coming, and danger pressed closer with each breath. In those moments, American troops understood they were fighting not just to hold ground, but to survive the next few seconds. Just when it seemed the American line might collapse under the unending pressure of the Japanese charge, something changed behind the ridge. The officers had been waiting, holding back their newest asset until the exact moment it would matter most. Supply trucks had delivered it only days earlier, and most soldiers had barely seen it in action. Rumors had spread across the camp, talk of a weapon that didn't just stop an advance, but tore it apart with overwhelming force. Many doubted it. Others prayed it was true, but no one had yet witnessed what it could truly unleash. Now, with enemy troops pushing closer and closer, the order finally came through. A group of men hurried forward, burdened by heavy cylinders on their backs and strange-looking nozzles clutched in their hands. Their faces were tight with concentration, their steps careful and determined. The infantry around them parted instinctively, unsure of what was about to happen, but understanding that whatever these men carried was not ordinary equipment. Support gunners and riflemen shifted aside, giving them a direct path to the front, where the Japanese charge had nearly reached its breaking point. The jungle around them crackled with tension. The Japanese troops were only seconds away from smashing into the central positions. Bayonets glinted between the trees as their battle cries grew louder. It was in this moment, this razor-thin gap between chaos and collapse, that the Americans revealed their new Firestorm. The first roar was unlike anything the battlefield had heard before. It wasn't the sharp crack of a rifle, nor the booming roll of artillery. It was deeper, an angry, guttural hiss that vibrated through the ground. A jet of flame exploded forward, bursting from the nozzle in a long, twisting stream that illuminated the night like a molten whip. For a split second, even the Americans froze, stunned by the sheer intensity of the light and heat blasting across the jungle floor. The Japanese soldiers, who had been charging with unshakable conviction, suddenly found themselves facing something no training manual had prepared them for. Their momentum stalled. The firestorm spread rapidly, crawling along the ground, wrapping itself around tree trunks, devouring leaves, vines, and anything in its path. The jungle canopy flickered orange as flames leapt upward, turning the darkness into a blinding inferno. What made this new weapon terrifying wasn't just the fire, it was its reach. The flame extended far beyond the distance of grenades or rifles, washing over enemy formations that had believed themselves moments away from victory. Those at the front stumbled back, their charge disrupted, their morale shaken for the first time. Men who had sprinted forward without fear now found themselves caught in a chaos utterly different from gunfire or explosions. For the Americans watching from behind, the weapon seemed almost alive, a dragon unleashed in the heart of the jungle. The air filled with heat, smoke, and a rumbling roar that drowned out all other sounds. It was as if the battlefield itself had shifted, as if night and fire were wrestling for control of the ridge. In those fiery moments, the Japanese infantry faced a reality none of them expected. They could not push through this. Not with courage, not with numbers, not with the relentless spirit that had carried them so far. The new American firestorm had arrived, and it was rewriting what was possible in a single, devastating strike. The moment the firestorm erupted, the entire battlefield shifted as if someone had torn a hole in reality. Only seconds earlier, the Japanese charge had been a tidal wave of bodies and voices surging through the trees, unstoppable and full of violent momentum. But now, with the sudden rise of flame, everything their advance had been built on, speed, intimidation, unity, was shattered in an instant. The fire didn't move politely. It lunged forward, twisting and snapping like a living creature. It illuminated every branch, every patch of earth, every silhouette caught in its reach. The once dark jungle was suddenly painted in shades of orange, red, and gold, turning the night into a flickering, almost unreal landscape. What made this moment unforgettable was not just the fire itself, but the way it warped the battlefield's rhythm. Japanese troops, who just moments earlier had been shouting with fierce determination, now found themselves hesitating, their voices faltering under the roar of the flames. The firestorm surged outward in long, sweeping arcs, forcing them to break their formation. Their tight, packed charge turned into a scattered wave, then into fragments of confused movement as soldiers scrambled for cover that no longer offered safety. The very trees they had counted on for concealment were now blazing pillars, exposing them in the glow. For the Americans, the transformation was just as dramatic. Men who had been bracing for impact rifles shaking, hands slick with sweat, stood in stunned silence as the firestorm pushed back the enemy that had been moments from overrunning them. Machine gunners who had been rationing their last belts of ammunition now had a few seconds to breathe. Riflemen who had been firing desperately into the dark now saw the battlefield open up before them, lit like a burning stage. The fire had carved a boundary through the jungle, a line the Japanese infantry could no longer cross. The flames didn't just attack bodies, they attacked confidence. The Japanese soldiers had been trained to ignore fear, to treat death as an honor, but no amount of discipline could prepare them for a weapon that erased the ground beneath their feet. Their charge, once tightly coordinated, dissolved as leaders shouted desperately to reorganize their men. But their orders were drowned out by the roar of the fire and the crackle of burning underbrush. Each attempt to regroup was met with another burst of flame that forced them back again. What had been an advance now became a retreat, though many refused to acknowledge it. American officers seized the moment immediately. They shouted for their men to hold steady, to tighten the line, to conserve ammunition. Some soldiers, still breathing hard, watched the fire's edge with wide, disbelieving eyes. They had never seen anything change a battle so completely, so quickly. It felt like the ground itself had chosen a side. The psychological shift was enormous. The Americans, moments ago on the brink of desperation, felt a surge of hope, while the Japanese faced a kind of shock they had not expected. It wasn't just physical resistance anymore. It was a counterattack that burned through their confidence as fiercely as it burned through the jungle. The battlefield no longer belonged to the charging infantry. It belonged to the fire. The psychological shock that rippled through both sides in the moments after the firestorm ignited was unlike anything the soldiers had experienced before. For the Americans, who had been moments away from being overrun, it felt as though the world had suddenly tilted back into their favor. The pressure that had been suffocating them lifted, replaced by a raw and unexpected surge of relief. Their hands still shook, their breaths still came in short, shallow bursts, and their ears rang from the chaos, but now they could see, really see, the shift happening before their eyes. The Japanese charge that once looked unstoppable was breaking apart, its force dissolving in the face of the flames that now dominated the battlefield. They watched through the flickering light as enemy shapes retreated, stumbled, scattered, no longer unified by the iron determination that had driven them forward. Yet the American soldiers were not celebrating. Far from it. Many stood frozen, their faces illuminated by the firelight, caught between awe and disbelief. They had heard stories about what these new flamethrowers could do, but seeing it in action was another matter entirely. Some felt a twinge of fear themselves, an instinctive reaction to the sheer power of the weapon, unleashed only feet away. The flames roared like a creature that did not care who it consumed, and the soldiers handling it had expressions hardened not by victory, but by responsibility. They knew they were holding something dangerous, something that changed not just battles but men. For the Japanese infantry, the impact was even more profound. Their doctrine, their spirit, their very foundation was built on the belief that courage could overcome any weapon. They trained to push through machine gun fire, to storm bunkers, to fight to the last breath. But nothing in their training prepared them for a weapon that could erase the very ground they stood on, that turned cover into a trap and thick jungle into a furnace. The firestorm didn't just stop them. It confronted them with a force that felt unnatural, overwhelming, and utterly indifferent to their bravery. The psychological toll was immediate. Soldiers who had been shouting with conviction moments earlier now faltered, unsure whether to advance, retreat, or simply freeze in place. Their senses were overloaded by the heat, the light, and the choking smoke that curled through the trees. Leaders among them tried to rally their men, shouting commands that were swallowed by the roar of flames and the crackle of burning leaves. But morale, self a fragile, living thing, began to buckle. The Japanese troops, long known for their unwavering resolve, now faced an enemy whose weapon shattered not just bodies but confidence. It was the first time many realized that courage alone could not push through every obstacle. Some hesitated for the first time in their military lives. Others looked to their fellow soldiers for reassurance, but found only the same fear reflected back. This moment, this clash of fire and determination, created a psychological divide on the battlefield. The Americans felt their spirits rise, buoyed by the unexpected advantage, while the Japanese faced a sudden reckoning, a recognition that the battlefield had changed and that the firestorm had introduced a new kind of warfare that challenged everything they believed in. Long after the flames died down and the jungle returned to its thick, smoky darkness, the soldiers on both sides knew they had witnessed something that would echo far beyond that single night. The firestorm had not been just another weapon thrown into the chaos of war. It had been a turning point, a moment that marked a shift in power, strategy, and the very psychology of the Pacific conflict. The Americans, who had spent months fighting in brutal conditions, slowly realized that what happened on that ridge would change the course of future battles. The Japanese infantry, once confident in the unstoppable force of their fearless charges, now faced an enemy armed with a tool that could counter even their most devoted tactics. The next day, as smoky haze still hung low over the trees, American officers walked the scarred ground, quietly acknowledging what the weapon had accomplished. They saw trenches that had stood firm not because of manpower, but because fire had carved a barrier no infantry could cross. Word traveled quickly from unit to unit, talk of how the firestorm had turned what could have been a devastating defeat into a hard-earned stand. Men who had thought they'd never see another sunrise now understood how narrowly their survival had balanced on the cutting edge of innovation. They whispered about the moment the jungle lit up, the moment the tide turned, the moment history itself seemed to pivot. For the Japanese, the aftermath was equally significant, though felt in a very different way. Survivors withdrew through the battered undergrowth, many silent, their minds wrestling with questions they had never confronted. Their commanders had taught them that courage was stronger than steel, that spirit could outmatch firepower, that the human will was the ultimate weapon. But this new enemy firestorm didn't fight like men fought. It didn't rely on bullets or blades, on lines or formations. It devoured everything without hesitation. It changed the environment, reshaped the battlefield, and rendered traditional tactics useless the moment it ignited. Officers struggled to reassure their troops. They spoke of regrouping, of adapting, of pushing forward again. But deep down, they felt the weight of the truth settling in. The Americans had introduced something new, something unpredictable, something that could fracture even the most disciplined charge. For a force that had relied so heavily on the psychological shock of their assaults, this realization was a severe blow. Their enemies had found a countermeasure that didn't just wound bodies. It wounded doctrine, strategy, and confidence. In the days that followed, intelligence reports circulated through both armies. Americans began planning ways to incorporate the Firestorm weapon into more operations, understanding that it had become a powerful equalizer in terrain that favored ambush and aggression. The Japanese command debated how to adapt their strategies, how to maintain morale, how to convince their soldiers that courage alone could still win battles in a world where fire swallowed courage whole. What happened that night was not just a clash of forces. It was a moment that pushed the war into a new phase, a moment that proved innovation could break even the oldest, strongest military traditions, a moment that reminded everyone that wars pivot not only on the bravery of men, but on the arrival of something new, something unexpected, something powerful enough to change the path of history in a single burst of flame. What happened that night was more than a battle. It was a clash between raw courage and a new kind of firepower that redefined the war. The Japanese infantry charged fearlessly, but the Americans unleashed a firestorm that changed everything. This unforgettable moment reminds us that in war, the outcome can sometimes pivot on a single weapon, a single decision, or a single spark. And history is written in the glow of those turning points.